Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm a compliance evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 416 of the FCPA Compliance Report. Today, I have back with me James Koukios. James is a partner at Morrison and Foerster, and we take a look at the firm's 2018 report on anti-corruption developments internationally. First, have you ever thought about starting your own podcast but really didn't know how? As you know, the Compliance Podcast Network is always on the lookout for some new podcasts. So if you'd like to consider starting your own podcast, please take a listen to our sponsor, One Stone Creative.
If you're enjoying this show, you might enjoy hosting your own. As an expert in your field, you have skills, knowledge, and insight that can help you expand your practice, meet new people, and create amazing content to share with the world. In as little as 2 hours a week, you can dramatically change how you promote, fill, and position your business. And One Stone Creative can show you how. Learn more at onestonecreative.net.
As always, when joined by James Koukios, I have a very interesting podcast for you today. We focus primarily on the international developments from December 2018. We take a look at serious fraud office prosecutions against Alstom employees from subsidiaries and how did the SFO fare. We take a look at new charges the SFO has brought in Petrobras spin-off investigations. We took a look at the impact of OECD Report, which found lack of sanctions against bribe takers in foreign bribery cases. We consider the French court fine against Total for bribes paid in Iran as far back as the last century. And finally, from the domestic sphere, we consider the December FCPA enforcement action involving Polycom, but we take a look at it from the perspective of the Supreme Court's ruling in Kokesh. It's a great podcast, as always. James is a fan favorite of this podcast and certainly a favorite of mine. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and we have back fan favorite James Koukios, my fellow U of M grad. James, first of all, Happy New Year. Welcome and go blue.
Happy New Year, go blue. We have our first loss of the year in basketball, but it was always tough to play in Wisconsin. So I think it's good for the boys to get that out of the way early.
I agree, and you're absolutely right about playing up there. We're here to talk about the Morrison and Foerster Top 10 Anti-Corruption Developments for December 2018 newsletter. And we had some very interesting developments in December. But one of the things that Morrison and Foerster has highlighted for us are some international anti-corruption cases, sort of separate and apart from the FCPA. So I thought we might really explore those, as typically we focus on domestic anti-corruption issues, James. And if we can start with, on your list, the Lithuanian bribery schemes and the power company, and it looks like the SFO was involved. So what can you tell us about this case?
Sure. So there were two announcements by the Serious Fraud Office in the UK in December about prosecutions involving Alstom subsidiaries. Alstom, of course, is the huge French company that does power and transportation projects. So subways, power plants, things like that. And of course, several years ago, DOJ had a very large resolution with Alstom here in the United States regarding several power projects around the world, including Indonesia. And Alstom has also been the subject of other prosecutions and investigations in other countries as well, and in fact was noted when France was reviewed by the OECD Working Group on Bribery. They actually mentioned Alstom in particular because there had been so many enforcement actions against Alstom outside of France. This is one of those. This is the two subsidiaries based in the UK that the Serious Fraud Office was investigating. The first one focused on the power business. And what happened in December was that the SFO announced that a former global sales director for the boiler business in the UK had been convicted of a conspiracy to corrupt for his role in an alleged scheme to bribe officials in a Lithuanian power station and to bribe senior Lithuanian politicians in order to win two contracts worth 240 million euro. They 2 days later, then they announced that this gentleman had been sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, which I'm not entirely sure how long you have to serve your sentence in the UK. I know in the US, of course, in the federal system, it's 80% if you have good time behavior. But anyway, you look at it, 4.5 years is a long time in prison. And he was also fined £50,000. That's, at least at a high level, not that dissimilar from what we heard about in the U.S. action as well, where there was allegations, for example, that some executives paid bribes to Indonesian officials to build a power plant there. A slight different type of subsidiary, moving from power now to transportation. The SFO also announced in its December 19th press release that Alstom Power, staying with Alstom Power, the Alstom Power and two executives had previously pleaded guilty in connection with that Lithuanian bribery scheme, but had not been previously announced. That press release then went on to also talk about the transportation subsidiary Alstom Network UK Limited, which the SFO announced had been found guilty of one count of conspiracy to corrupt in April 2018, so actually several months before, for making corrupt payments to win an 85 million euro tram and infrastructure contract in Tunisia. Interestingly, though, it wasn't all rosy for the SFO, because they also announced that Alstom Network and several of its executives were acquitted of other bribery schemes that were alleged to have taken place in Hungary, India, and Poland. So a very interesting announcement for if you're the SFO, both good news and bad news, and you have to commend them for releasing the bad news as well. But basically, the SFO had a little bit of a mixed record when it came to prosecuting the Alstom subsidiaries and their executives for bribery allegations. And it just goes to show, I think, these investigations take a long time to build. And especially in the UK, where the SFO does tend to go to trial in these cases, they have a bit of a mixed record. It's much better over the last several years, and they're not afraid to take things to trial. But it does show that there's still some growing pains, perhaps, in the program of the SFO.
Next up, James, you had a case about one of our old friends, Total. And they were fined by a French court, but the fact pattern seemed quite interesting, if not reminiscent of one we've seen before. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, and I think it is. This is Total, the French oil and gas group, and I believe this is related to the resolution that Total had with, at least factually, to the resolution that it had, the company had with SEC and DOJ in 2013. Just as a reminder, that was a fairly large resolution, a little less large now with the mega resolutions we saw in 2018, but at the time it was quite big. The Total had agreed to pay more than $398 million to resolve FCPA charges back in 2013. And this is another chapter in that story where a Paris court fined the company on December 21st, 2018, 500,000 euros for allegedly bribing Iranian officials in order to secure a contract for an Iranian oil field in 1997. So 21 years earlier. Everybody always complains about how long foreign bribery cases take, and the fact that there's such a delta between when the alleged conduct happens and when these things are resolved. And this is a pretty extreme example, 21 years between the date of the alleged bribe and the sentence. But according to the allegations, the company allegedly paid $30 million in bribes under the guise of a consulting contract to get this oil field contract. Now, interestingly, the French prosecutors did not get everything they wanted. So the court rejected their request to seize company assets that were in an amount equivalent to the estimated value of the proceeds of corruption. The prosecutors had estimated that to be 250 million euro and asked for what we would call a forfeiture award here in the United States. I'm not sure what the French term is, but the court rejected that and only went for a 500,000 euro fine.
So, James, I guess the thing that obviously the striking thing is the amount of the fine. We had in 2018 a case we visited on Societe Generale, where we had a major French effort in both investigation and enforcement around anti-bribery, anti-corruption. Do you see this case as inconsistent in any way with what the French court may have done on Societe Generale, or is it just two cases stand on their own feet?
Yeah, Tom, I think they stand on their own feet. The SocGen case obviously was very notable in large part because of the new French DPA regime and things that have happened subsequently in French law. This one, as we just discussed, is a very old case, which was resolved before those things were available. So I think there's a little bit of apples and oranges, and it may just be because of the large delta in time when these cases were actually resolved.
And next up, James, we had a report from the OECD, and it was a report where they criticized, or at least raised the question of whether public officials accepting bribes in from OECD-based companies ran the route. This is something that I think we talk about in the United States quite a bit in the context of the FCPA being designed as a a supply side law. But here in the United States, certainly, we've got a plethora of other laws which allow U.S. prosecutors to go after public officials when jurisdiction attaches. What did you think about this OECD report?
Sure. So I'll confess at the outset that I really like OECD reports. Anybody who reads the top 10 knows that we always try to include OECD reports in here because I think they're just a wealth of information about how different countries approach foreign bribery enforcement and their legal regimes. You learn a ton. They're really a crash course on some really detailed aspects of international law and procedure. And then occasionally they do reports like this where they kind of step back and they survey the foreign bribery enforcement landscape from a broad, or not a countrywide level, but across OECD country level. And that's one of these. So very interesting findings from my perspective. Basically, what the Working Group on Bribery did here is that they looked at all cases in which OECD-based companies had been punished for foreign bribery between 2008 and 2013. And there were 55 such cases during that 5-year window. And the OECD wanted to see, were the public officials who are allegedly involved in these bribery schemes also punished? And what the OECD Working Group found was that in more than half of the cases, countries actually did begin investigations against their officials who were allegedly bribed. And I think that's probably a positive development. Obviously, it'd be better if it was 100% to try to combat the demand side of foreign bribery. But a lot of times countries are reluctant to prosecute their own officials. As you mentioned here in the United States, we've decided for the most part that we should not, under the FCPA, prosecute foreign officials because of the potential political ramifications of doing so. And so we, as the U.S., rely on other countries to go after their officials as a general matter. Of course, not always, but oftentimes. So I think the fact that the OECD found that over half of the countries, or in over half of the cases, the countries where the officials were allegedly paid the bribes actually opened up an investigation is a positive story. The negative story from the OECD's viewpoint, though, is that the rate of punishment for those alleged crimes, was much lower. Only 1/5 of the cases were the bribe takers actually punished for those alleged wrongdoings. So interesting that the report also looked a little bit into what may be some of the causes of that record. And one thing that they found is that although there's been much made about the international cooperation on the supply side, And of course, we've seen that through the OECD member countries helping each other out and prosecuting bribe payers. The working group found that there was not the same kind of cooperation on the demand side of foreign bribery. In other words, countries were not helping other countries prosecute their own officials. And very interesting as well, the OECD found that the better source of information for the investigations into public officials was actually the media. That the media in the country where the bribe was paid picked up on the enforcement resolutions and reported on them, and that information was used to kick off investigations of the foreign officials. So very, very interesting. I mean, obviously, media is a great source for DOJ and SEC to open up investigations as well on the in other countries as well. But it's interesting here to see that the media actually plays a larger role in these kinds of prosecutions than international cooperation does.
So, James, I was wondering if we might end today's podcast by looking at one of the FCPA cases from December 2018, and that's the Polycom case. I really don't want to explore the kind of the facts of the case, but I wanted to take a look at it from an angle that I don't think has gotten, frankly, either enough or perhaps even any play, and that's the Kokesh angle. So I was wondering if you might remind the listeners what the Kokesh decision was and how you see that as a part of, or perhaps not a part of, the Polycom decision, or enforcement action, I should say.
Yes. So historically, the SEC had taken the position that there was no statute of limitations for disgorgement because that was an equitable remedy. That's actually set out in the FCPA resource guide. The SEC takes that position. And several appellate courts had actually agreed with the SEC on that. But in June of 2017, the United States Supreme Court disagreed and ruled that disgorgement was subject to the 5-year statute of limitations set out in the general statute of limitations statute for civil resolutions. And there's been a question since then, how would the SEC react to the Kokesh decision? Would they stop trying to disgorge money going back more than 5 years? Would they come up with creative ways to approach that? In my view, although it's not said, I see the Polycom decision as an alignment between SEC and DOJ to fill that gap. What happened in Polycom, from just if you look at the resolution standpoint, is that the SEC reached a resolution with the company that alleged misconduct from 2006 to 2014. They then agreed that they would disgorge about $16 million. About less than that. It was a little over $10 million, plus a civil penalty, plus prejudgment interest. And it looks like that $10 or $11 million disgorgement was limited to the alleged misconduct that fell within the 5-year statute of limitations. DOJ then went forward with a declination with disgorgement of its own and asked for additional money that presumably covered the entire period of the alleged bribery and then credited back the SEC portion of the disgorgement. So what I see happening here is SEC and DOJ decided that this company had made illicit profits for a longer period of time than the SEC could reach. But the SEC couldn't reach it because of Kokesh. So DOJ would step in and say, we'll give you a declination, but you've got to disgorge the profits for the entire time period. That's a very creative solution where it shows that the SEC and DOJ FCPA units are very highly coordinated and working together in FCPA resolutions. Not necessarily great news for corporate defendants or individual defendants as well. I mean, you would like to think that you'd have a more of an argument on the defense side because of Kokesh, but now we see, at least in FCPA context, DOJ and SEC are going to work together to try to limit the ability for companies and individuals to raise those kind of defenses. And so I see Polycom as a very instructive case on how companies and individuals should approach DOJ and SEC with respect to statute of limitations issues.
James, do you see this bringing greater certainty around this process, or does it go the other way?
No, it goes the other way. I mean, we always knew, I think most observers knew that SEC wasn't just going to fully go away on the Kokesh issues. And my experience with SEC is they've been, frankly, as aggressive as ever. And it doesn't seem like Kokesh has limited them too much in the FCPA context. So I think this is one of those examples where you never know what DOJ and SEC are going to do. There could be a case where DOJ believes it's not appropriate to use its discretion this way. But it sort of, rather than a company feeling pretty good that you're going to be able to limit your damages to 5-year period, this almost in some ways extends it for as long as DOJ has the company under a rock as well.
Well, James, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I've been visiting today with James Koukios, partner at Morrison and Foerster, on the firm's most excellent top 10 international anti-corruption developments for December 2018. James, I can't wait to see what you guys come up with for January 2019.
Happy New Year. Thanks, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. Please remember, if you'd like to start a podcast, I'm always looking out for some new podcasts on the Compliance Podcast Network. We've got Great Women in Compliance. We've got Popcorn in Compliance. We've got a Sports and Compliance coming on, and we've got Forensic Auditing with Jonathan Marks. So if you want to throw your hat in the ring and start your own podcast, please let me know. I hope you'll join me again next week, where I have another guest relating to FCPA compliance on the FCPA Compliance Report. Thanks again for listening.